The courthouse stood like a monument of old justice in the center of the small American town, its brick walls weathered by decades of trials, whispers, and verdicts. On this particular morning, the building felt heavier than usual, as though the weight of what was about to unfold pressed against its wooden beams. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching on the dust that floated lazily in the air, but the brightness did little to soften the tension inside. Inside the courtroom, every seat was taken. Journalists scribbled on their notepads, the townsfolk leaned forward on wooden benches, and officers in uniform lined the back wall. Everyone had come to witness the trial of Richard Hale, a man accused of a crime so chilling it had split the town into two camps. Some swore he was innocent, a victim of false accusations. Others whispered he was guilty beyond doubt, but clever enough to wriggle free unless justice finally tightened its grip. The accused sat at the defense table, his posture stiff, his eyes sharp and calculating. He wore a suit, though it hung a little loosely on his frame, as if prison nights had already begun to eat away at him. His lawyer, a confident man in his 40s with slick-back hair, leaned close now and then, whispering strategies in his ear. Each time, Richard gave a short, tight nod, never letting his gaze wander too far from the jurors who would soon decide his fate. Across from them, the prosecutor, a woman known for her fierce determination, arranged her files meticulously. She adjusted her glasses, smoothed her blazer, and scanned the room as if measuring the resolve of every soul present. The crime had shaken her as much as it had the town, and she was determined not to let sympathy for the accused cloud the truth. Then there was the police dog. A German shepherd named Rex, sleek and disciplined, sat beside his handler near the prosecutor's table. His amber eyes scanned the courtroom with the same calm authority as the judge himself. Trained to detect lies, danger, and fear, Rex represented trust in law enforcement. To the jury and many of the onlookers, his presence was reassuring, a reminder that justice had many forms, some with fur and sharp teeth. But not everyone looked reassured. At the far end of the courtroom, a young woman sat clutching her small daughter tightly. The woman's hair was tied back neatly, though stray strands framed her tired face. She shifted uneasily in her seat, bouncing the little girl on her lap to keep her calm. The child, barely 3 years old, fidgeted restlessly, swinging her legs and clinging to her mother's necklace. At first glance, she was just another child forced to sit through a grown-up matter she could not possibly understand. Yet, unlike the adults who whispered about the accused or scribbled legal notes, the girl's attention was locked on something very different: the police dog. Her round eyes followed Rex wherever he moved, studying him with a focus far too intense for her age. She tilted her head slightly as though trying to place a memory, something deep in her young mind sparking recognition. Every time the dog adjusted his paws or shifted his ears, her gaze sharpened. Her mother noticed and whispered, "Sweetheart, just sit quietly." But the little girl's grip on her mother's dress tightened. The atmosphere thickened as the judge entered, his black robe swaying with each deliberate step. He took his place at the bench, his presence commanding immediate silence. "This court is now in session," he declared, his voice booming across the room. Papers rustled, lawyers straightened, and even Rex seemed to sit taller at the sound. The prosecutor began her opening statement, her voice calm but edged with conviction. She painted the accused as a man of hidden cruelty, someone who had used charm to mask darker deeds. The defense interrupted often, objecting to her tone or phrasing, but the judge waved most objections aside. The jury watched closely, trying to parse truth from performance. All the while, the 3-year-old remained transfixed on the dog. She didn't shift when the prosecutor's voice rose, nor did she flinch when the defense raised objections. Her entire body seemed centered on Rex, her tiny hand occasionally pointing, though she said nothing yet. The dog, for his part, appeared indifferent to her stare, but there was something subtle in the way his ears twitched when her gaze lingered too long, as though he, too, sensed the weight of her attention. From the gallery, people whispered about the case details. Some wondered why the police dog was even present in court. "Symbolic," one man muttered. makes the jury think law and order is on the prosecution's side. Another woman whispered back, "That dog's more honest than half the witnesses we'll hear." Laughter flickered for a moment, then was quickly swallowed by the seriousness of the room. Meanwhile, the little girl's mother rubbed her daughter's back soothingly, whispering promises of candy if she stayed quiet. The child nodded but never took her eyes off Rex. For her, the courtroom drama meant little. The sharp voices of lawyers, the gavel's echo, the weighty stares of the jury. But the dog meant something else, something important. Minutes stretched into an hour as the prosecutor laid out the foundations of the case. Witnesses were called, evidence described, and the accused sat stone-faced through it all. But even as testimony flowed, small ripples of distraction passed through the audience. Many noticed the child's unwavering focus, the way she leaned forward with every movement of the dog. Cute, some thought. Odd, others whispered. But no one realized that this small, fidgety presence would soon change the course of everything. For now she was just a child in her mother's arms, a child watching a dog. Yet beneath her innocent stare lay a memory that had not yet surfaced, a truth too heavy for her small frame but too important to stay buried. The courtroom buzzed with human voices, but silence seemed to loom above them all, waiting, just waiting, for the moment when that memory would spill out in the most unexpected way. And when it did, no one, judge, jury, or criminal, would be ready for what came next. The clock ticked softly above the judge's bench, each passing second echoing in the heavy silence of the courtroom. Morning had slipped into late noon, yet the proceedings carried on without pause. Everyone inside could feel it, the tension that curled around their throats and made the air thicker, as though justice itself was holding its breath. The prosecutor, Ms., stood tall in front of the jury, her voice measured and calm but edged with iron resolve. She spoke of the crime with precision, unfolding each detail like pages of a dark story no one wanted to read but could not turn away from. She laid out timelines, witness statements, and motive, painting Richard Hale as a man who wore civility like a mask but hid cruelty underneath. The jurors listened intently. Some leaned forward with their elbows resting on their knees, others crossed their arms defensively, but not a single pair of eyes drifted away from her. Every word was a needle threading suspicion deeper into their minds. At the defense table, Richard Hale sat unblinking, his jaw clenched tight. His lawyer, Crane, scribbled furious notes and occasionally rose to object objection, Your Honor, speculative. Objection, leading the witness each time with a tone sharpened by annoyance. Most objections were overruled. Richard's lips curled faintly, but he quickly masked the expression. He was used to controlling how people saw him, but for the first time, cracks were beginning to show. And then there was Rex. The German shepherd sat with an aura of composure beside his handler, Officer Briggs. His glossy coat reflected the faint light seeping through the tall windows, and his amber eyes remained fixed forward. At first glance, he seemed merely a silent spectator, but his presence was more than ornamental. Every so often, his ears flicked toward the sound of raised voices, or his head tilted slightly when witnesses approached the stand. He looked like he was listening, almost understanding. To the townspeople crowded into the benches, Rex was a symbol of order. Some whispered proudly about him, remembering how he had once tracked a missing child through the woods, saving her life. Others felt comforted, as though justice itself had fangs and sat at attention before them. But not everyone felt reassured. The little girl, still seated in her mother's lap near the back row, had not once looked away from Rex. Her small body shifted restlessly, her tiny shoes tapping against the wooden bench. Her mother tried to distract her with a soft whisper, pointing toward the high stained-glass windows or the judge's gavel, but the child would only blink and return her gaze to the dog. Her eyes, round and unblinking, carried something unusual for a child her age. Curiosity, yes, but also wariness. She clutched her mother's necklace so tightly that her small knuckles turned pale. Whenever Rex moved, even subtly, she leaned closer, almost as if ready to retreat if he came nearer. No one but her mother noticed at first. Most adults were too absorbed by the clash of arguments in the courtroom. Yet slowly, one or two jurors began to glance at the girl when her little finger rose, pointing once more at the dog. They dismissed it with faint smiles, thinking, children notice everything. Still, her unrelenting stare carried weight, even if no one yet understood why. The defense attorney rose for his opening remarks, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. He spoke passionately, painting Richard as a man wrongfully accused, a man whose life had been destroyed by gossip and fear. "We must not," he warned the jury, "let fear and prejudice replace truth. This is America, where innocence is assumed until proven otherwise." His words rolled confidently across the room, but they seemed to slide past the little girl as though they didn't exist. She continued watching Rex, whose tail tapped once against the polished floor before going still again. The judge, an elderly man with silver hair and weary eyes, adjusted his glasses as he listened to both sides. Years of trials had made him numb to theatrics, but today felt different. He couldn't place why. Perhaps it was the charged energy between the prosecutor and defense. Perhaps it was the way the gallery sat unusually rigid, as if they sensed something unseen was pressing upon them. And perhaps, though he didn't consciously register it, it was the quiet, unwavering stare of a child. A witness was called to the stand, Mrs. Cooper, an elderly woman who lived near the scene of the crime. Her voice trembled as she spoke, recounting strange noises that night and a figure she swore resembled Richard Hale. The prosecutor guided her gently, the defense attempted to shake her certainty, and the jury listened with tight lips. As Mrs. Cooper, the little girl, wriggled and sat upright. Her eyes flicked from the old woman to Rex, then back again, as if trying to connect dots only she could see. Her mouth opened slightly as though she wanted to speak, but her mother quickly pressed a finger to her lips, whispering, "Not now, sweetie." The child obeyed for the moment. Meanwhile, the whispers in the gallery grew. People muttered about the strength of the prosecutor's case, about the calmness of the accused, about the possibility of justice finally being served. Others remained skeptical, muttering that juries could be swayed by emotion, that innocence might be crushed by rumor. The air buzzed with opinions, each one a thread in the web of uncertainty that wrapped around the room. Still, above it all, the tension clung. Even the smallest sounds, a cough, a shuffled paper, the creak of a bench, felt amplified. When the judge's gavel struck once more to call for order, the sound cracked through the air like thunder. Rex shifted again, his gaze briefly sweeping toward the back row. For the first time, his amber eyes locked with the little girl. She froze, gripping her mother's dress. The connection lasted only seconds, but it was enough. A flicker of recognition passed across her face, recognition that made her bottom lip tremble. Her mother, sensing the change, pulled her closer and whispered soothing words. But the child would not be soothed. Her small hand lifted once more, pointing toward Rex, though no sound came from her lips yet. The moment passed quickly. Lawyers resumed their sparring, the witness was excused, and another was called. The rhythm of the trial carried on, but something had shifted beneath the surface. A quiet tension, invisible but undeniable, threaded through the air. The child's stare was no longer something to smile at, it was becoming unsettling. No one knew it yet, but the courtroom had just reached a silent tipping point. What seemed like nothing, a little girl staring at a dog, was building toward a disruption that would soon freeze every person in the room. And when it happened, no objection, no ruling, no polished argument would be able to contain it. The afternoon sun had shifted, spilling golden light through the high courtroom windows. Dust particles floated lazily in its glow, but no one noticed them. Every person inside that room was locked in a silent, invisible battle, prosecutor against defense, truth against doubt, justice against manipulation. And somewhere in the back, a little girl against something she didn't even understand. The trial had reached one of its most crucial moments. The prosecution was presenting photographic evidence, grainy but significant images that placed Richard Hale near the scene of the crime. A detective pointed at the projected images on the courtroom wall, explaining the timestamps, the surveillance angle, and the route Hale had allegedly taken that night. All eyes were fixed on the screen, all except one pair. The 3-year-old girl still stared at Rex. The police dog hadn't moved much since the trial began. He sat patiently beside Officer Briggs, ears occasionally twitching, his leash held loosely in the officer's hand. Most people had forgotten he was even there, but the child hadn't. Her small chest rose and fell a little faster now, her eyes wide and unblinking, her little lips parting as if words were pushing their way up from somewhere deep inside. Her mother noticed the shift immediately. "What's wrong, sweetie?" she whispered, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead. The child didn't answer, she pointed. Her mother hushed gently, smiling apologetically at the people seated nearby. "We need to be quiet here." But the girl didn't stop pointing. Her tiny index finger remained raised, aimed steadily at Rex, like she was identifying something only she could see. The prosecutor continued explaining the evidence, and the jury nodded thoughtfully. Richard Hale leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk, the kind that said he still believed he could win. The judge jotted a note on the bench, while reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. No one was paying attention to the little girl. Not yet. Then, without warning, a high-pitched voice pierced through the silence. "Doggy." The word rang through the courtroom like a bell. Every head turned. A few people chuckled softly. The judge paused mid-note and lifted his eyes toward the back rows. Even the prosecutor halted, blinking in mild surprise. "Order, please," the judge said, smiling slightly to soften his tone. "Little one, we need quiet while the grown-ups are speaking." Her mother's face flushed red with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor," she whispered. "She's just—" But the girl wasn't done. Her eyes didn't leave Rex. Her small hand still pointed toward him, trembling slightly now. She leaned forward as if trying to get closer, her little voice breaking the air once more. "Doggy bad." The room froze. The words were soft but crystal clear, spoken with the unfiltered certainty only a child could possess. They sliced through the hum of the trial, silencing every murmur, every shuffle, every rustle of paper. Even the ceiling fan seemed to pause for a moment. At first, people thought they'd misheard her. A few exchanged puzzled looks. Some smiled awkwardly. But the child didn't repeat herself with a giggle or a nonsense word. She sat upright, still pointing, her eyes locked on Rex with something that looked eerily like fear. "Sweetheart," her mother whispered urgently, trying to pull her hand down. "We don't say things like that." But the little girl resisted. Her voice grew firmer. "Bad dog." This time the words echoed. This time they landed. The courtroom changed in an instant. Laughter vanished. Whispering stopped. Dozens of eyes turned from the child to the German shepherd sitting calmly at the front. Rex, sensing the sudden attention, shifted slightly on his paws. His ears perked up, and for the first time that day, he let out a faint, low whine. "Bad dog," the girl repeated, more insistent now. "Bad." A ripple of unease passed through the room. People weren't sure what to think. She was just a toddler, maybe she was scared of dogs, maybe she was acting out, maybe it meant nothing. But the timing, the way she said it, the unwavering certainty in her little voice, it felt like something more. The prosecutor exchanged a confused glance with Officer Briggs. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, studying the girl curiously over his glasses. "Mrs. Miller," the judge said gently to the mother, "is everything all right?" "Yes, Your Honor," the woman stammered. "I'm so sorry. She's never done anything like this before. She's tired, that's all." But the child wasn't tired. Her small face was pale, her brows drawn together in confusion, or was it memory? She whispered the words again, this time almost to herself, like she was recalling something she couldn't fully explain. Bad dog, bad dog. Richard Hale, who had been watching the scene unfold with mild amusement at first, now shifted in his seat. The smirk was gone. His hands fidgeted in his lap. Something about those two words had unsettled him deeply, more than anyone else in the room. The defense attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, perhaps we should clear the gallery if there's going to be." "No," the judge interrupted softly, his gaze still fixed on the child. "Let's continue. I'm sure this will pass." But it didn't. The girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, "that's the bad dog." Her mother froze. "What do you mean, honey?" Her daughter's lip trembled slightly. "That's the doggy from the bad night." It was barely a whisper, too quiet for most people to hear. But the two people who did hear it were enough, the mother and the man sitting on trial. Richard Hale's eyes widened. Just for a second, just long enough for the prosecutor, watching him closely, to notice. "Objection," Crane barked suddenly, his voice louder than necessary. "This is ridiculous. We're allowing a toddler to disrupt the integrity of these proceedings." But his voice carried a hint of panic now, and panic had a smell. The prosecutor caught it instantly. "No further questions, Your Honor," she said calmly, hiding the spark of interest that had just ignited in her chest. She didn't know why, but something about that moment mattered. A bad dog, a bad night, a reaction from the accused. The courtroom eventually regained some order. The judge, after a few moments, asked everyone to settle down and the trial resumed. But the energy in the room had shifted. It was subtle but undeniable. The jury, once entirely focused on the evidence, now glanced occasionally toward Rex. The prosecutor, though she tried to focus on the witness testimony, kept replaying the girl's words in her mind. And Richard Hale, who had been cool and composed for most of the trial, now seemed agitated, his leg bouncing under the table, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee. As for the child, she had gone quiet again. Whatever memory had surfaced inside her small mind had now retreated, leaving behind only a lingering unease. She rested her head against her mother's chest, sucking her thumb, but her eyes, those watchful, knowing eyes, never left the dog. And Rex was no longer perfectly still. The dog had shifted closer to Officer Briggs, his ears flattened, his tail rigid. It was subtle, but to a trained handler the meaning was clear. The animal was responding to something, a scent, a memory, a presence. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was recognition. No one could name it yet, but the courtroom could feel it. Something had just cracked beneath the surface, something that had been buried deep. And the crack had come not from a piece of evidence, not from a witness, not even from a confession, but from the soft, innocent voice of a 3-year-old girl. And though the trial continued as if nothing had happened, everyone knew that everything had changed. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap no one had expected. "Bad dog." Simple, childlike, but spoken with a clarity that seemed far too sharp for her tender age. The courtroom froze in a silence so deep it felt unnatural, as though the very walls were listening. Jurors stopped mid-breath. Reporters lowered their pens, uncertain if they just witnessed something worth recording. Even the judge, seasoned by decades of outbursts, confessions, and drama, sat motionless, his gavel resting in his hand. At the center of it all, the 3-year-old girl pointed, her eyes locked on Rex, her small voice repeating the words like a mantra. "Bad dog, bad dog." The German shepherd shifted uneasily, his ears pressed back against his skull, his body leaning slightly toward his handler. Officer Briggs gave the leash a quick tug, whispering, "Easy, boy, easy." But the dog's reaction did not go unnoticed. This was not the calm, unshakable police dog the jury had seen earlier. Something in the child's words had unsettled him. Gasps rippled through the gallery. "Did she just?" a woman whispered. "She said bad dog," another replied, her voice trembling. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Order in the court," he announced, striking his gavel once. But the sound didn't break the spell. It only reminded everyone how strange, how hauntingly strange the interruption had been. The prosecutor's mind raced. Children said strange things all the time, but this didn't feel random. It was too sharp, too pointed, too real. She glanced at Richard Hale, searching his face for a reaction, and there it was. He was pale. His lips had lost their color, and his jaw was locked so tightly it looked painful. His hands, folded neatly on the defense table before, now gripped the edge of it until his knuckles turned white. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. He knows something. Meanwhile, the defense attorney rose to his feet with exaggerated annoyance. "Your Honor, I must protest. We cannot allow the ramblings of a toddler to disrupt these proceedings. She's a child, for heaven's sake. Children say whatever pops into their heads. If we treat every word as evidence, this trial will descend into chaos." His voice rang with confidence, but his eyes betrayed urgency. He wanted this dismissed, buried, forgotten as quickly as possible. The judge nodded slowly. "Mr. Crane, you are correct that children are not witnesses in this trial. However," his gaze drifted to the little girl, who now clutched her mother's blouse tightly, her small face pale but determined. "We cannot ignore the disruption. Mrs. Miller, please control your daughter." The mother nodded frantically, whispering to her child, "Baby, please stop. You're scaring everyone." But the girl shook her head stubbornly, whispering once more, "Bad dog." The room trembled with unease. The prosecutor rose. "Your Honor, if I may," she said carefully. "The child's reaction may be unrelated. However, her recognition of the police dog is curious. Could we perhaps clarify where the dog was before being assigned to Officer Briggs?" The defense attorney slammed his palm against the table. "Absolutely not. This is outrageous. Are we really entertaining the words of a toddler as grounds to question evidence?" But the judge raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Crane." His eyes flicked to Officer Briggs. "Officer, please answer the question." The officer stiffened. "Rex was reassigned to my unit 2 years ago, Your Honor. Before that, he was privately owned." A murmur shot through the courtroom like a spark through dry grass. The prosecutor's head snapped up. "Privately owned? By whom?" Officer Briggs hesitated, glancing at the defense table. Richard Hale stared at him, eyes sharp as though daring him to speak. Briggs swallowed hard. "By the defendant, Richard Hale." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even cries of shock filled the air. The judge banged his gavel furiously. "Order, I said order." But order could not be restored. The weight of that revelation had crashed down on everyone like a landslide. The dog, the one symbol of truth, loyalty, and justice in the room, had once belonged to the man now accused of unspeakable crime. And a 3-year-old girl had just recognized him. The prosecutor's pulse hammered. She remembered. Somehow that child remembered. The defense attorney scrambled to control the damage. "This is circumstantial at best, a coincidence, a reassignment, nothing more. The jury must disregard this nonsense." But no one was disregarding it. Not the jury, who whispered furiously among themselves. Not the gallery, who stared with wide, fearful eyes. And certainly not the accused, who now sat rigid, sweat glistening on his brow. The little girl pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, whispering again and again, "Bad dog, as if those 2 words carried more meaning than anyone in that courtroom wanted to admit. Rex whined once more. His body shifted closer to the defense table, his nose twitching in the air as though searching for a scent he remembered. Officer Briggs gripped the leash tightly, whispering, "Heel, Rex, stay." But even he looked unsettled, glancing back toward the child. For the first time in his career, the officer didn't trust his own dog. The judge leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed deeply. He was a man of law, not superstition. He knew better than to let a child's words dictate the course of justice. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just happened. The kind of moment that peeled back the veil of order and revealed the raw, ugly truth beneath. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Every person in the room waited for someone else to speak, to explain, to make sense of it. But no explanation came. Only the echo of two small words that refused to fade. Bad dog. And in that silence, in that unbearable stillness, it became clear. The trial had changed. The direction of justice had shifted. What had once seemed like a straightforward battle of evidence and arguments was now tangled with something no one could ignore. A child had spoken, and her innocence carried more weight than 100 sworn testimonies. The courtroom, once firm and steady, was now frozen in place, every heart pounding with the same terrifying question. What did the little girl know? The air in the courtroom had shifted. What had started as a trial bound by rigid order and measured words was now crackling with unease, as though everyone present had been dropped into the middle of a mystery none of them were prepared to solve. The girl's small voice, 2 words, simple but powerful, continued to echo in every corner of the room. Bad dog. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. Clear, certain, without hesitation. The jurors sat stiffly in their seats, their eyes darting between the little girl, the restless dog, and the defendant whose calm mask had cracked. One of the jurors, an elderly man with spectacles, leaned toward another and whispered, "That wasn't coincidence." His neighbor, a middle-aged woman, nodded, lips pressed into a tight line. They weren't supposed to talk, not yet, but the temptation to share their unease was too strong. Reporters furiously scribbled notes, their eyes alight with the promise of a story that would ripple far beyond the courthouse walls. A child disrupting a trial, a police dog unsettled by her words, and the revelation that the dog once belonged to the accused. It was the kind of headline that sold papers, that people whispered about for years. The judge's gavel struck again and again, but even his authority couldn't wipe away the whispers. "Order," he barked. "I demand silence." Slowly, the noise subsided, but the atmosphere remained charged, every face still turned toward the child. At the prosecution table, Rachel's mind was racing. She hadn't planned for this. No one could have. But as she studied the little girl clinging tightly to her mother, Rachel knew this was no trivial interruption. The dog's unease, the defendant's pale expression, the jury's discomfort, it all added up to an opening. And in law, openings were everything. She rose carefully, her tone respectful. "Your Honor, while I understand the court's concern about disruptions, I must point out that the child's reaction appears tied to the evidence. The dog is not just any exhibit. He once belonged to the defendant." Defense attorney Daniel Crane shot to his feet before she could continue. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. We cannot allow speculation based on a toddler's tantrum. Are we really turning this trial into a circus because a 3-year-old shouted something?" But his voice carried a trace of desperation. He was fighting too hard, too fast. The jury noticed, the judge noticed, and Rachel noticed. The judge held up his hand. "Mr. Crane, sit down. You've made your objection. It is duly noted." However, his gaze lingered on the defendant, who now sat stiff, his jaw tight. "The court cannot ignore relevant facts. The prosecution may continue." Crane dropped back into his chair, muttering under his breath, but his eyes flicked to his client with barely concealed frustration. Rachel turned back to the courtroom, her voice steady. "Ladies, what you've just witnessed may seem unusual, but sometimes truth comes from the most unexpected places. This child recognized something about that dog, something the rest of us overlooked, and in doing so, she revealed a hidden connection between the defendant and the very evidence presented before you." The jury shifted uncomfortably, their faces unreadable, but their attention locked firmly on her. At that moment, an elderly woman in the gallery gasped. "I remember that dog," she whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "I seen him before, all the way back when." Her voice trailed off as a deputy warned her to be quiet, but the damage was done. Dozens of eyes turned to her, curiosity sparked. The murmur spread. People remembered. Bits and pieces of moments in passing. A large German shepherd with Richard Hale in the park. A dog barking behind Hale's property. A child in the neighborhood once chased by the same animal. These fragments surfaced now like long-buried secrets, stitched together by the girl's innocent words. And then came the most unsettling detail of all. A man in the back row leaned forward, speaking to the person beside him. "Didn't someone say they heard a dog barking the night of the crime?" the whisper carried, reaching eager ears. "Near the victim's house." Rachel caught it too. Her heart skipped. She hadn't considered the dog's involvement. No one had. But if the animal had been present that night, if the child had recognized him from there. She glanced at Hale. His eyes darted around the courtroom, searching for an anchor, something to hold onto as the walls seemed to close in. He wiped sweat from his brow, his fingers twitching restlessly. "Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice sharper now, "the child's words may seem small, but they have unlocked a series of recollections. Witnesses are remembering connections. The jury is witnessing them firsthand. This cannot be ignored. I request permission to reopen examination regarding the dog's past association with the defendant." Crane exploded. "Objection! Outrageous! This is not evidence, it's hearsay. Idle chatter in the gallery should not dictate the direction of this trial." But his voice rang hollow. Even the judge looked unconvinced by his fervor. "Overruled," the judge said flatly. "The prosecution may proceed." Rachel pressed her advantage. "Officer Briggs, when Rex was reassigned to you, were you aware of the circumstances surrounding the transfer?" The officer stiffened. "No, ma'am. I was only told the animal had been surrendered due to personal reasons." "By Mr. Hale?" "Yes." The courtroom buzzed again. Hale gripped the edge of the defense table so tightly his knuckles were bone white. Rachel leaned closer, her eyes sharp as blades. "So, the defendant not only owned Rex but also relinquished him at nearly the same time the crime occurred. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" Crane was on his feet again, sputtering objections, but the damage was irreversible. The jury had seen Hale's reaction. They'd seen the dog's unease. And most damning of all, they'd heard a child's simple, unshakable declaration. The girl nestled into her mother's arms, unaware of the storm she had unleashed. To her, Rex was just the bad dog she remembered. But to everyone else in that courtroom, she had just shifted the balance of truth. And while the judge called for order once more, while attorneys argued and papers rustled, the undercurrent was clear. The trial had been altered forever. The ripple had begun, and it was spreading faster than anyone could contain. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of order and law. It felt like a stage where every glance, every whisper, every nervous breath might reveal the truth hiding in plain sight. The ripple from the little girl's words had turned into a wave, and it was crashing relentlessly toward Richard Hale. The judge called a recess, his booming voice echoing across the room. "This court will reconvene in 1 hour. Jurors are instructed not to discuss the case among themselves." His gavel struck, but even as people shuffled to their feet, the air remained thick with suspicion. Rachel gathered her files, her mind racing. She had never seen a defense unravel this quickly, not from evidence or arguments, but from the unfiltered honesty of a child. She knew she had to move fast. Hale's attorney would use the recess to regroup, to twist the narrative, to paint the girl's outburst as meaningless. But Rachel also knew one thing: the truth had already taken root. She stepped into the hallway, where reporters swarmed, microphones flashing like hungry birds. "Ms., do you believe the girl's statement will change the outcome? Is the police dog tied to the crime? Will the prosecution call the child as a witness?" She ignored them, her mind already forming the next steps. She needed confirmation, proof that the connection between Hale and Rex was more than coincidence. Inside a smaller conference room, she found Officer Briggs waiting uneasily, Rex lying at his feet. The dog's ears twitched with every sound in the hallway, but his amber eyes remained fixed on his handler, uncertain. Rachel closed the door behind her. "Officer, we need to talk. When Rex was reassigned to you, was there anything at all, that suggested he had been involved in something unusual before you took him?" Briggs frowned, his fingers tightening on the leash. "Look, ma'am, Rex is one of the best dogs I've ever worked with, but there was something odd. When I first got him, he had scars along his muzzle like someone had forced him into fights or used him roughly. I was told not to ask questions." Rachel's chest tightened. "And you accepted that?" Briggs hesitated. "Orders were clear. He passed all the retraining tests. He was reliable, so I didn't push it." Rachel leaned in. "Do you understand what's happening here? That little girl recognized Rex. She called him a bad dog. Not just because she didn't like his face, but because she remembered something. If Hale owned Rex during the time of the crime, then this animal may have been present the night it happened. He may have been part of it." The officer paled. "You think Hale used Rex?" Rachel didn't answer. The silence said enough. Meanwhile, in another room, Daniel Crane was furiously whispering to his client. His polished demeanor was slipping, beads of sweat forming at his temples. "You didn't tell me you owned that dog," Crane hissed. Hale's voice was low, defensive. "It wasn't important. I gave him up before the crime. How was I supposed to know they'd drag the mud in here?" Crane slammed his hand against the table. "Not important. Your dog is sitting in that courtroom, reacting to a child who somehow remembers him. That makes it look like he was there that night. Do you understand the damage this does to your case?" Hale leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Then fix it. That's what I'm paying you for." Crane swallowed his anger, straightening his tie. "I'll fix it. But if the jury believes for even 1 second that child's words connect you to the scene, we're finished. Do you hear me? Finished." Back in the courtroom, the recess ended. The jury returned, still buzzing from what they had seen. The little girl remained with her mother in the gallery, now quieter but watchful, her big eyes fixed on Rex. The judge addressed the court. "We will resume. Prosecution, you may proceed." Rachel stood. Her voice was calm but deliberate. "Your Honor," before recess, questions were raised about the history of this police dog, Rex. "I believe the jury deserves clarity. To that end, I request permission to call an additional witness, an animal control officer who handled Rex's transfer." Crane shot up. "Objection. We are straying far from relevant testimony. This is an attempt to distract the jury with theatrics." But the judge shook his head. "Overruled. I will allow it. Proceed." Moments later, officer took the stand. She was a sturdy woman with sharp eyes, her uniform crisp. Sworn in, she began recounting the details. "Yes, I facilitated the surrender of the animal. Richard Hale brought Rex to the station. He said the dog was becoming too aggressive, too difficult to manage." Rachel's brow arched. "Aggressive?" "Yes, ma'am. In fact, I noted in the file that Hale specifically mentioned Rex had been present during a stressful night shortly before the surrender. He didn't explain further, but—" her eyes flicked toward the defendant. "He seemed eager to be rid of him." The jury leaned forward. The connection was tightening like a noose. Rachel asked, "Officer, in your professional opinion, could a child who witnessed the dog during a traumatic event remember him, even years later?" Nodded firmly. "Absolutely. Children are more perceptive than people realize. They may not remember details adults think are important, but they never forget what frightened them." Whispers erupted again. The girl's words, "bad dog," suddenly carried even greater weight. Crane pounced on cross-examination, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Officer, are you seriously suggesting this court rely on the supposed memory of a toddler? Children see monsters under their beds. They imagine shadows as ghosts. You can't possibly treat their words as fact." Met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps, but this child didn't point at a shadow. She pointed at that dog, and that dog belonged to your client." The impact landed like a hammer. The jury glanced at Hale, whose face had hardened into a mask of fury. By the time court adjourned for the day, the story had grown legs of its own. Reporters flooded the steps, broadcasting headlines about the toddler witness and the dog that remembered. The public was captivated. Inside his home, Hale sat in darkness, his fists clenched. He could feel the case slipping away. A 3-year-old had pierced the wall of lies he'd built, and now his own dog, his loyal companion once used to intimidate and terrify, was the key to his unraveling. Meanwhile, the little girl lay asleep in her mother's arms, unaware of the storm she had unleashed. To her, it was simple. She had seen a dog she knew, a dog that frightened her, a dog she called bad. But to the court, to the jury, and to the nation watching from afar, her words were no longer just words. They were the thread unraveling everything. The courtroom was packed than it had been at any point during the trial. Word had spread quickly after the last session. A 3-year-old girl had called the police dog a bad dog, and the defendant had once owned the same animal. Reporters filled every seat in the press row. Sketch artists rushed their pencils across paper, and even ordinary townspeople who had never before stepped inside a courthouse now pressed against the gallery railings, eager to see what would happen next. Rachel felt the weight of it all as she arranged her notes on the table, but beneath her calm exterior, her heart was pounding with anticipation. She could feel the case tilting in her favor. The jury wasn't just listening anymore. They were watching, analyzing, connecting dots. The child's simple words had changed everything. Across from her, Daniel Crane sat rigid, his jaw tight. He had tried everything in his power to downplay the girl's outburst, but nothing had worked. The jurors had seen too much, heard too much. Now he sat beside his client, whispering urgently, but Richard Hale's eyes were fixed on the dog sitting calmly at his handler's feet. Hale looked like a man staring at a ghost. The judge entered, his gavel striking once. "Court is back in session." Rachel stood, her voice clear and commanding. "Your Honor, ladies and of the jury, today we will address the connection between the defendant, Richard Hale, and the evidence you have seen before you. We will not rely on speculation. We will not rely on imagination. We will rely on facts, and those facts begin with this dog, Rex." All eyes turned toward the German Shepherd. Rex sat still, his amber eyes watchful. For most in the room, he was just an animal. But for one little girl, he was the key to a memory too important to ignore. Rachel called her next witness, Detective Alan Price, the lead investigator who had revisited the crime scene after the child's revelation. He stepped onto the stand, his face grim. "Detective Price," Rachel began, "did your team evidence after the court revealed Rex once belonged to the defendant?" "Yes, ma'am. We reviewed the scene and discovered overlooked details. Specifically, animal tracks, paw prints consistent with a German Shepherd, were found near the victim's back fence. At the time, they were dismissed as belonging to a stray. Now we know better." The jury leaned in. Rachel pressed on. "And what did further analysis show?" Price cleared his throat. "The prints match Rex's measurements exactly." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Rachel let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "So Rex was present at the scene the night of the crime?" "Yes." Rachel turned to the jury, her voice steady. "Ladies, and this means Richard Hale brought Rex with him, his own dog, the same dog this child recognized, the same dog she remembers as bad. She remembered because she was there, or near enough to see." Crane leapt to his feet. "Objection! This is a leap of logic. A child's frightened words do not constitute evidence of presence." But the judge shook his head. "The detective's testimony is factual, overruled." Crane sank back down, his knuckles white around his pen. Rachel wasn't finished. "Detective, was there anything else linking Rex to the crime?" Price hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. During the re-examination, we also recovered fibers, dog hair, caught in the victim's torn clothing. DNA testing confirmed they belonged to Rex. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the reporters paused, their pens frozen mid-word. Rachel's gaze swept across the jury. The defendant's dog was there. His dog left traces on the victim. His dog was surrendered days after the crime under suspicious circumstances. And when faced with that same animal in this courtroom, a 3-year-old child, too young to fabricate such detail, recognized him instantly and called him exactly what she remembered: a bad dog. Hale shifted in his seat, his face flushed, sweat beading along his forehead. The mask he had worn for weeks was crumbling. Crane stood for cross-examination, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Detective Price, could those paw prints have come from any German shepherd? There are thousands in this state." "No," Price replied firmly. "The spacing, the size, the pressure, these prints are a precise match for Rex." Crane swallowed hard. And the hair, could it have transferred later? Could it have come from the victim encountering the dog another time? Price shook his head. There's no record of the victim ever interacting with Rex. The timing, the evidence, and the surrender all point to one conclusion: Rex was used during the commission of the crime. The jury's eyes locked on Hale. He shifted again, his breathing shallow. Rachel rose for her final question. "Detective, in your expert opinion, did Richard Hale bring Rex with him the night of the crime?" "Yes, absolutely." The words landed like a hammer. The tension in the room was unbearable. The little girl, still seated in her mother's lap, looked around in confusion, unaware of how much her tiny voice had accomplished. She clutched a toy doll, whispering softly, "Bad dog," as if reminding everyone why they were there. Hale slammed his hands against the table suddenly, startling everyone. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice hoarse. "You're all chasing shadows, listening to a baby's nonsense." The judge's gavel thundered. "Mr. Hale, you will control yourself." But the damage was done. The jury had seen the outburst, the desperation. Rachel remained silent, knowing Hale was undoing himself with every word. Crane leaned toward him, hissing under his breath, "Stop talking. For God's sake, stop." But Hale couldn't. His composure had shattered. "She's just a kid. She doesn't know what she saw," he shouted, pointing toward the girl. "She doesn't." His voice broke, and for the first time he faltered. The gallery buzzed, reporters scribbling furiously, jurors exchanging glances heavy with suspicion. Rachel stood slowly. "Your Honor, the prosecution rests its case." The judge nodded, his expression grim. "Court will resume tomorrow for closing arguments." As the gavel struck, Hale slumped in his chair, trembling with rage and fear. The jury filed out, their faces etched with certainty. The ripple that had started with 2 innocent words had become a tidal wave, crashing through every defense he had tried to build. And in the quiet that followed, one truth became undeniable. Richard Hale was breaking. The little girl had shattered the silence. The detective had confirmed the evidence. And now the truth was unfolding before everyone's eyes. There was nowhere left for him to hide. The final day of the trial dawned with gray skis rolling over the courthouse, as if even the weather understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Crowds gathered on the steps, their breath visible in the morning chill, murmurs spreading like wildfire through the sea of faces. Reporters jockeyed for position, cameras flashing, pens poised. Everyone wanted to be present for the ending of a case that had captivated the nation. Inside, the courtroom brimmed with a tension so heavy it seemed to press against the very walls. Jurors shuffled into their seats, their expressions grim, hardened by the weight of what they had witnessed over the past weeks. At the prosecution's table, Rachel arranged her closing notes, her heart steady now. She knew the truth had spoken louder than any argument she could craft. Across the aisle, Daniel Crane sat hunched, his tie slightly loosened, his eyes hollow. He had fought valiantly, But the battle had slipped from his grasp the moment a child pointed her finger and spoke two simple words. And there sat Richard Hale, the accused, the once proud man whose calm arrogance had dissolved into panic and fury. His suit was rumpled, his face pale, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. He knew the walls were closing in, yet still clung to the last fraying threads of denial. The judge entered, the gavel struck. "This court is in session. We will hear closing arguments." Rachel rose first, her voice clear and unwavering. "Ladies and of the jury, you have heard testimony, examined evidence, and seen reactions no one in this room could ignore. You saw a child point at a dog and call him what she remembered, a bad dog. You saw the dog respond, unsettled, as though he, too, remembered. You heard from officers and detectives who confirmed that this very animal once belonged to the defendant and that his presence is irrefutably tied to the crime scene." She paused, letting the silence carry her words deeper. "You may wonder, how could a child be the key to such a case? But that is the power of innocence. Children do not scheme. They do not manipulate. They simply speak what they know to be true. And in doing so, this child opened the door to evidence that proved what the defense tried to conceal. Richard Hale committed this crime, and he thought no one would ever uncover it. He was wrong." Rachel turned toward the jury, her eyes steady. "Justice demands courage. It demands that you see through the shadows, that you honor not only the evidence but also the voices too small to stand here themselves. Today, you carry that responsibility. We ask you to deliver the only verdict consistent with truth: guilty." She sat down, the weight of her words lingering. Crane rose slowly, tugging at his jacket, but his voice lacked the fire it once carried. "Ladies, and I beg you, do not let superstition replace logic. Yes, a child spoke. Yes, a dog shifted on his leash. But are we truly to throw away the principles of law because of theatrics? Children imagine monsters. Dogs react to moods. None of that proves murder." He spread his hands desperately. "Look beyond the spectacle. The prosecution wants you to believe in fairy tales, but this is no fairy tale. This is a man's life. And if you condemn him based on the words of a toddler, then justice itself will be guilty." He sat, his shoulders slumping, knowing even as the words left his mouth that they had fallen flat. The judge turned to the jury. "You have heard the arguments. You will now deliberate." Hours passed. The courthouse remained on edge, every creak of the wooden benches by the silence. In the gallery, the little girl slept in her mother's arms, her doll clutched tightly against her chest, unaware that her voice now echoed inside the minds of 12 strangers deciding a man's fate. When the jury finally returned, the air grew electric. The foreman, a stern-faced woman with steady eyes, stood and handed the paper to the bailiff. The judge unfolded it, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up. "In the matter of the state versus Richard Hale on the charge of first-degree murder, the jury finds the defendant guilty." The word crashed like thunder. Gasps erupted, followed by murmurs and cries. Reporters bolted for the doors, shouting into phones, scribbling headlines. The gallery buzzed with relief, with vindication, with the awe of having witnessed history. At the defense table, Crane dropped his head into his hands, defeated. Beside him, Richard Hale exploded. "No, this is a sham, a setup. You can't do this to me." He struggled against deputies as they moved to restrain him, his voice a hoarse roar. "It's a lie, all of it. A lie told by a child." But his words were drowned out by the gavel pounding. "Order, order," the judge barked. Deputies wrestled Hale into cuffs, dragging him from the courtroom as his shouts faded down the hall. The little girl stirred at the noise, blinking sleepily, then looked at her mother. "Bad man," she whispered. Her mother hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, baby, bad man." The weeks that followed turned the case into legend. Newspapers dubbed it the trial of the child's truth. Television anchors replayed the moment the girl had pointed at Rex, her small voice echoing across living rooms across the country. Editorials debated the weight of innocence in a system built on hard evidence. But everywhere the conclusion was the same: justice had been served. Rachel became known as the prosecutor who turned a child's words into the cornerstone of a conviction. She was lauded for her composure, her tenacity, but privately she knew the credit did not belong to her. It belonged to a little girl who had spoken when no one else could. Officer Briggs requested Rex be quietly retired from duty. Though the dog had served faithfully since his reassignment, the shadows of his past lingered. Rex was relocated to a rural property where he could live out his days without the burden of the trial that had marked his name. As for Richard Hale, he was sentenced to life without parole. His empire of intimidation collapsed overnight, his name forever linked to the case that a child had unraveled. And the girl, she returned to her ordinary life, too young to understand the role she had played. Yet in her town, in her community, she became a symbol, a reminder that truth can come from the of voices. Years later, the courthouse still bore the echoes of that day. Judges spoke of it in hushed tones, lawyers referenced it in arguments, and jurors who had been there recounted the moment they froze, hearts stopped, when a child pointed her finger and spoke two words that carried the weight of justice. Bad dog. It was a story retold in classrooms, in news specials, in conversations late at night, not because of the crime itself, but because of what it revealed about truth. Truth doesn't always shout from the witness stand. Sometimes it whispers from the lips of a child, too young to know its power but strong enough to change the course of lives. And so it was that in a crowded courtroom, justice had not come from the lawyers or the evidence or even the dog on the leash. It had come from the innocence of a 3-year-old girl who reminded the world that even the smallest voice could bring the mightiest to their knees.